Before we get started with the last bit of cut content for part 1 of ReZero, my partners over at Bookwalker are kicking off this season of Isekai with a massive promotion. A new year, new life sale where you can get up to 50% back in coin on over 185 different digital Isekai novels and manga. So if you've ever wanted to read the source material for what's pretty much every Isekai anime ever made, then now would definitely be the best time to get started. You can pick up ReZero right from where we are in volume 13. Or start the highly promising upcoming Mushoku Tensei from the very beginning. There's also this season's Tensida and Log Horizon as well, plus many other great series that you've seen featured on the channel before. So be sure to make the most out of this Isekai promotion before it ends on January 8th. And if it's your first time using Bookwalker, then you can also use code ANNIENEWS to get an additional $5 off your first ebook purchase. It's honestly a great way to support both the industry and my channel. But anyway, now let's talk about ReZero. The second half of episode 38 brings us to chapter 2 of volume 13, a chapter that goes by the title of Ignoring the Odds. It starts moments after Subaru had just parted ways with all the witches. As we know, Patrash had gone and dragged him out from the tomb, taking the tomb's punishment in the process. But rather than a few scratches like how we saw in the anime, Patrash's scales were oozing with blood. A lot of her body seemed to be bleeding profusely. The strange thing about these injuries though was that they didn't seem to have come from the outside. Her scales didn't indicate any type of physical damage. Instead, it was as if these injuries had originated internally. So that's a small detail that makes whatever enforces the tomb's edict a bit more interesting. In any case, because Patrash had done so much, Subaru wanted to know the why behind it. He wanted to know why she was willing to go so far for him. So he asked Otto to use his blessing of language to find that out for him. Of course, Otto initially thought this to be a joke. I mean, to him the answer was already obvious, and he didn't think that Subaru was actually this oblivious. But Subaru's expression of confusion dictated otherwise. Now, the thing about Otto's blessing is that his ability to converse with animals isn't the same thing as a direct word-for-word translation. It's more like a vague transmission of thought, one that he then has to interpret himself. So to get a proper answer from Patrash wasn't exactly possible. When he did pose the question though, the answer Patrash gave was something along the lines of this. But Otto believed it would make more sense to convey her answer a different way. Something like, "Do I really need to say it for you to understand?" was the best translation that he could come up with. The thing is, no matter how many times he tried to rephrase it, Subaru simply couldn't understand what he was trying to say. Otto had to literally spell it out for him so that he could finally understand Patrash's feelings. Once he did, it was a moment that really resonated with his recent confession to Liv. It made him realize that perhaps his desire to be treasured by others wasn't just a distant dream anymore. So this was the first time that Subaru had opened his eyes to this. That's why he couldn't help but be overcome by the emotion of it. Now, Patrash wasn't the only one to convey their feelings to Subaru here. Otto had actually done the same as well. He was just a bit more indirect about it. You see, after Subaru had asked if he was worried about him, Otto simply said that this concern was only for the sake of his own future. He then went on to say that if he ever found himself in peril, the first thing he was always going to do was run. There was no sense of duty to Subaru or anyone else that made him feel the urge to put himself in danger for them. It was a very realistic point of view. But something about the way Otto was saying it seemed off. There wasn't really any conviction in it. It came off as something a little bit more lighthearted. So, before Subaru merely nodded it off, he first reflected on those words, then thought about how they contradicted Otto's actions from the previous loops. I mean, this was the person who rescued him from imprisonment. It was the same man who saved him from Garfield and fought tooth and nail to get him free from Sanctuary. So it was very clear to Subaru that this was all an act. A facade in which the only response he could give was one of rejection. He starkly told Otto that he wasn't the kind of person to run away, and the reason for that was because they were friends. It was a moment that Subaru used to return an earlier gesture of friendship. Now, with all that settled, Subaru then contemplated over the events of the Tea Party. Having just parted ways with an ally he thought he could rely on definitely stung more than he expected it to. He did, however, understand the necessity to do so. That said, Subaru didn't really consider Echidna to be evil. She was simply a person who he could never agree with, a statement that could be said for pretty much all the other witches as well. On the other hand, Satella had actually given him something to think about. And that brings into topic the slight spoiler that we talked about last episode. So if you don't want to know what that is, then go ahead and skip to the following timestamp. But anyway, Satella's advice to rely on those he found precious directly contradicted her actions. I mean, she was, after all, the person that forbid him from talking about return by death. So that could only mean that it wasn't Satella who employed that restriction. Instead, it was none other than the Witch of Jealousy, her separate personality that manifested from the absorption of an incompatible witch factor. If that was in fact true, then that meant the person who Subaru made the promise with was Satella. A very significant new piece of information that he really needed to ponder. But right now what mattered the most was breaking out of this stalemate. You see, the mansion, the rabbits, the barrier, Roswaal's goal, and even Garfield all served as obstacles that blocked the path that Subaru needed to traverse. So Satella wasn't quite at the top of his concerns right now. That said, there was a bit more progress made on the subject of Garfield. Echidna's final piece of advice had given him a lead to follow. Although very minor, knowing Garfield has a fear of the outside world did show Subaru that he now had to appeal to Garfield as a person, something that he didn't think to be necessary in any of the other loops. So, with Garfield now being a factor that needs to be considered, that made clearing the Tombs trial an absolute necessity. Because this was now at the top of the priority list, Subaru became concerned by the number of trials that were left. He wasn't sure if he'd passed the second trial or not, so he went towards the tomb with the intention of challenging the trials again. Yes, he was afraid of the possibility of having to face the unknowable presence, but this was the only way to know for sure which trial he was on. Which leads us to the reveal that he was no longer qualified. A revelation that meant it was now impossible for him to liberate Sanctuary. With both that and the cooperation of Echidna now gone, Subaru's only remaining choice was to rely on Roswaal, a person that he could now only see as a monster overcome by obsession. Luckily for Subaru, that obsession was the very thing he was hoping to take advantage of. It brings us to a conversation that actually had quite a bit more to it. The one we saw in the anime was a more simplified version. You see, if Subaru could convince Roswaal that he was acting in accordance with the book's will, then perhaps he could trick Roswaal into cooperating. I mean, there really wasn't any way for him to tell that Subaru was lying. So if Subaru said what Roswaal wanted to hear, and basically acted as the person he needed him to be, then there was a very good chance that Roswaal could be deceived into helping him. At first, this actually looked as if it was working. There was a moment when Roswaal was seriously considering an answer to his question. But to imagine that someone like Echidna left a convenient way past her barrier, well, that wasn't something very conceivable. As Roswaal continued to ponder the thought, Subaru became more comfortable as he believed that Roswaal had fallen for his trap. But it was that very comfort that led him to make a crucial mistake. He began to reveal things a bit too willingly and a bit too quickly. It was an unnatural form of behavior that Roswaal literally found to be sus. He found that Subaru's actions didn't match his words. I mean, Subaru's resolve to help Amelia was supposed to be at its peak, so it didn't make sense for him to want to find this loophole. When confronted about it, Subaru tried to rationalize his idea by saying the method wasn't important. In comparison to the White Whale or the Witch Cult, liberating Sanctuary wasn't exactly the most noteworthy achievement. So if improving Amelia's position in the royal selection was the overall goal, then Sanctuary wasn't something they needed to waste time on. He was trying to convince Roswaal that it didn't matter how Sanctuary was liberated. From a logical point of view, this line of reasoning definitely made complete sense. But it wasn't something that Roswaal could accept as the truth. Because he was yet to confirm the specifics of Subaru's authority, he refused to assist with the search for a loophole, stating that if Subaru truly wanted to be trusted as a co-conspirator, then all he needed to do was liberate Sanctuary the right way. Of course, Subaru tried to fight the idea, but the more he resisted the notion, the more suspicious Roswaal became. Eventually, the conversation had made a complete 180. Roswaal was now backing Subaru into a corner where the only answer left was the one where he would accept doing the trials, bringing us to the moment when he began to question Subaru's resolve. Now, normally Subaru would have had no problem sacrificing everything to save the person most precious to him. I mean, he was quite literally a handshake away from doing exactly that. But a recent encounter made him realize that he didn't want to. So, because this wasn't the Subaru that Roswaal needed, he simply lay himself back down and made it clear that this loop wasn't worth living in anymore. He was just going to watch Subaru's futile struggle then proceed to end his own life. Another point that wasn't made clear in the anime. That said, Subaru wasn't ready to let that happen. If Roswaal died, then he'd have to restart for sure. So, in an attempt to salvage this loop, Subaru began to question Roswaal's intent, leading to the whole speech about life, future, hope, and possibility, as well as the revelation about his involvement with the mansion. Since this scene was taken word for word from the novels, not much needs to be said other than a little bit about Subaru's mindset. It was here that Subaru realized he'd completely underestimated Roswaal's knowledge of the loop. Any advantage he believed he'd obtained from Return by Death was nothing more than his own presumptive arrogance. Roswaal had created a plot so infallible that not even Return by Death could beat it. That's why Subaru saw the need to apologize. He now understood that Roswaal was the only person this entire time who had any power over anything. To think anything else was nothing more than pure conceit. Once Subaru realized that nothing could be done, he left Roswaal's room and started to aimlessly wander the forest, bringing us to a cut scene in which Subaru was contemplating everything he learned. As he did, he began to realize that this probably wasn't the first time Roswaal had hired Elsa. The whole situation in the capital was likely part of his plans as well. Felt stealing Amelia's jewel, then Elsa being hired to buy it back, were nothing more than elaborate moves made with the purpose of getting Subaru to intervene. So Subaru could only think about how he'd been manipulated since the first day he'd come here. If everything truly was in accordance with the Book of Knowledge, then perhaps his idea of free will was nothing more than the extension of someone else's. Perhaps he never actually had a choice at all. This carries some pretty serious implications with it. It would mean that getting trapped in Sanctuary and even Rem losing her existence were all events that happened as someone else predicted. It would mean that everything that's happened up until now was completely predetermined by someone else. That someone else wasn't Roswaal though. He was just the person enforcing it. As we know, he would do anything to correct a path that doesn't match with what the book has outlined. So his purpose was only to make the prophecy become a reality. That said, something about this setup just seemed off. There was a remaining mystery regarding these texts that prevented Subaru from piecing everything together. He just couldn't figure out what it was. As he continued to go over the details regarding the Book of Knowledge, that's when Amelia appeared along the path and called to him. It was the second time that he'd bumped into her in the middle of the night. Just from a quick glance at Subaru's face, Amelia knew right away that something was wrong. So she offered to listen to anything that Subaru wanted to say, leading to a very emotional conversation that I think will be included next episode. So rather than talk about it now, we'll wait for episode 39 and skip ahead to the next part. It was after this conversation with Amelia that Subaru found himself racing aimlessly through the forest. The only thing he could think about was what Amelia just said to him. This was because her words had spurred an uncontrollable feeling of shame that Subaru couldn't help but try to run away from. I can't really say much more without talking about the conversation itself, but this was why we saw him running. He had realized something important that made him feel shame with the way he'd been thinking up until now. So this was his only response to those feelings. Now, everything after regarding the parts with Otto was pretty much the same. So this brings us to the last episode of ReZero Season 2 Part 1. Hopefully you gained some new insight and are a bit more refreshed for Part 2. You can expect those episodes of cut content to be out every Tuesday before the next episode, just like how it was last season. Now, before I go, don't forget to make the most out of Bookwalker's Isekai sale before it ends on January 8th. And if it's your first time doing so, then you can use code ANNIENEWS to get $5 off your first digital purchase. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!